is pointless.
First, distract target.
Bring it on! I can take you!
Discombobulate. Dazed, will attempt wild haymaker. Employ elbow block.
Dragonstar Varnir is a great game that's disguised as a shit one for the first 30 minutes. First impressions are everything, and the first thing you hear in this game is this really cringe, borderline hilarious intro where the generic American movie trailer guy explains the plot in a way you just can't take seriously.
The Holy Emperor, supreme ruler of all.
Then you're introduced to Zephy. This boy fucking sucks. I don't know if it's his weird anime-ass tuft of colored hair or the fact that the only way to revive him is to give him dragon's blood through a kiss, or maybe his weird looking lips, but regardless of the reason, I look at him and instinctively think,
You are Mr. Gay.
And then of course we've got the token big titty chick. Don't you just love anime? And now onto the actual game. Dragonstar Varnir has a lot going on. The premise is actually really well thought out. Dragons rule the lands and terrorize humankind. Entire military units of soldiers, known as the Knights of Requiem, are required to take on just one dragon. These dragons have a very strange method of reproduction. Some female humans are born with the seed of a dragon in their womb.
I can feel the heartbeat.
The dragon growing inside them gives the host a strange appearance and magical abilities inherited from the dragon, which grow in intensity as the dragon develops and the host gets older. Once it's ready to be birthed, the dragon eats its way through the witch's stomach, killing her in the process. Because of this, witches only live to early adulthood, despite aging and maturing at the same rate as humans. Not only do they live short lives, but they're also the second main target of the Knights of Requiem, due to them being the key to the reproduction of dragons. Our story follows Zephy, who, after being raised his entire life as a knight that hunts witches, is suddenly granted witches' powers and is now a target of the knights he once fought alongside.
Reconsider what you're doing. Gran.
Zephy and the other characters appear to be so trash tier when first introduced, but straight up ascend out of the garbage can a few chapters later. They're developed in a very interesting way. It's not that they change drastically throughout the story because of certain events, but rather, you begin to understand why they act the way they do as you're exposed to more and more of life from their perspective. Kari Karo lashes out at everyone and is hyper-aggressive to the idea that her already shortened life is coming to a premature close, knowing that her loved ones will helplessly suffer the same fate as her. Minessa is so overprotective of the younger witches because she wants them to have the life she never did. She doesn't want to expose them to the horrible world that awaits them outside of their den, where their kind is hated and hunted. She wants them to live the best lives they can given the circumstances and remain sheltered from the horrors that she had to experience at a young age. This game has wonderful, touching themes of family. None of these witches are related by blood, and yet the most unlikely individuals are able to make bonds, find happiness in one another's company, and love each other regardless. It calls forth the question of, what does it mean to be family? It's the best compile heart story I've experienced thus far. It's a strangely poetic tale about spending time with loved ones and letting them know what they mean to you while you still can, because you won't know it's too late until it already is. In compile heart games, the story tends to be very hit or miss. Some people find the writing to be too cringy, too edgy, or too obsessed with the zeitgeist of modern Japanese anime. But the one thing that most can agree on is that compile heart always finds great ways to make their turn-based combat feel unique and different from everyone else's. I rewrote this section multiple times while trying to keep it concise, but also not leaving anything important out. And I found that the best way to do that is to only touch upon the more unique aspects of Dragonstar's combat. So while I'm talking about all of this, just assume that it's more complex than I'm letting on. In combat, there are 3 levels of verticality, which I'll simply be referring to as levels, that each character can transverse freely during their turn. Magical attacks can be done from any level to any level, but physical attacks can only be done when on the same level as the targeted enemy. Larger enemies, typically bosses, take up multiple levels, allowing the player to target various body parts which will then disable certain attacks from the enemy. Each character can have a partner which can then be switched between without using up their turn. Deciding who will be paired together is a large aspect of customization because there are many different strategies which can be employed through your choices regarding them. When allies attack and receive damage, they build up their Dragon Rage meter. Once the meter is full, upon their next turn, characters will transform into their dragon form and receive massive stat bonuses as well as heal to full health.
I have power. They can't take it away from me.
This typically lasts about 3 to 4 turns depending on the damage received. Characters can also put their dragon form timer on pause by switching out with their partner. Enemies and allies are weak not only to elemental types but also physical damage types. There are no physical damage spells but a huge variety of physical attacks. For example, one might hit enemies in 2 columns, one might make a cross shape, one might hit multiple times.
3, 4.
When an enemy is struck by the physical and magical attack types which they are weak to, the weak point meter will rise. Upon reaching 100%, this will prompt a weak point rush where all characters attack at once for free. Correctly timing the attack that prompts this is huge, as it's the difference between doing a few hundred and a few thousand damage. In an ideal situation, you would want all of your damage dealers to be on the field and be in dragon form when a weak point rush occurs to maximize damage. The way abilities are unlocked is by devouring other dragons,
Was that the bite of 87?
which gives access to their skill tree. I love this so much more than just being given abilities for leveling up, as it's genuinely fun and exciting to see new enemies and wonder what's in their skill tree. It also allows for so much more strategy to be employed. There's a shared pool of Devour abilities as well as a unique Devour ability for each character, which is only usable in dragon form. These are insane skills which not only have a chance to devour, but also deal a hell of a lot of damage and have sick animations. My favorite is Minessa's water dragon dance.
Back at it again at Krispy Kreme.
The important thing to note about the devouring mechanic is that you have a certain amount of points that can be spent on skill trees per character, and that only the character who scores the devouring blow on the enemy will unlock their skill tree. These points for unlocking abilities in the skill trees are passively acquired through combat. Now this, on the surface level, seems like a fucking bitch because you have to devour each enemy for each character in order to get its skill tree for everyone. But allow me to tell you why it's not a bitch and why it's actually genius game design. One may be led to believe that since the points used on these skill trees can be grinded for, and the skill trees themselves can also be grinded for, that this just encourages absurd amounts of grinding to pad out the game's length. This is actually the exact opposite of why the Devour mechanic exists, and let me tell you why. In nearly every negative review I've read about this game on Steam, they all mention the same thing, the little sister mechanic. I don't know if I've ever seen what appears to be such a universally hated mechanic, but the funniest thing about it, I think it's amazingly well designed. In the Witch's Den, there are 3 little sisters which must be cared for by feeding them dragon meat. Though if you feed them too much, the dragon inside them will grow and kill them. Don't feed them any, and they go insane and run off. The thing is that the longer you spend in dungeons leveling and getting stronger, the more fights you take and grinding you do, the more you need to feed them and the bigger the dragon within them grows. Therefore, you're essentially on a time limit to complete the game and find a cure for the witch's curse before it's too late. This ties wonderfully into the narrative of the game, as the witches don't have the time to enjoy their lives to the fullest due to their shortened lifespan. There's a sense of urgency involved with the idea that time is of the essence, and the amount of time you take to get to the end will affect the outcome of the story. So now let me tie this back to why Devouring isn't a bitch and that this is all 200 IQ game design. Since stopping to devour all enemies for all allies as well as grinding out skill tree points takes time, doing so is heavily discouraged because of the little sisters. You simply don't have the time to stop and level everyone fully and be totally prepared for the next dungeon or boss fight. The game doesn't want you to grind mindlessly. It instead encourages strategic planning for who should devour what dragons to obtain the most necessary skills. It's because of this that I highly suggest playing the game on hard difficulty. In other games, you can just grind and level up to meet the newly inflated enemy HP and damage numbers. But since you can't mindlessly grind in Dragonstar Varnir, the higher difficulty really allows the game's genius design to reach its full potential, making you think and plan ahead much more than you would otherwise need to. I hope that it's clear how passionate I am about how great Dragonstar's game design is, but that doesn't mean it's without its faults. While I enjoy the option optional bonding scenes with the other witches, I ultimately wish that there was no underlying romance involved. Depending on your ending, you can get a romantic epilogue with the character who you bonded the most with. While some of this dialogue is pretty cute, I feel that it ultimately damages the heavy family themes in this game. These characters are supposed to love each other because they're family, not because they're attracted to each other.
I hate this!
I already talked about the garbage intro, but just, yeah, it's bad. It's pretty common for the audio of localized JRPGs to be mixed like garbage, but being common doesn't make it okay. You can't even hear what the characters are saying during their transformation dialogue. I played around with it a good bit, and if you're going to play this game, make these your audio settings from the start. I ultimately have to say that the music of Star Varnir is definitely a weak link that ultimately harms the game's story and can pull you out of the immersion. Most of it is hopelessly generic fantasy stuff, and there just aren't enough tracks to not be stupid repetitive during dialogue. This is made even more disappointing by the fact that previous Compile Heart games have had really good soundtracks. But the same love in that area wasn't given to this title. This isn't intrinsically a bad thing, but one should know before buying the game that a huge amount of it is visual novel cutscenes. I'm talking like maybe 50-50 gameplay to cutscenes. While I personally enjoyed the cutscenes and loved the story behind Dragonstar, I think it would have been a real breath of fresh air to occasionally replace a 2D cutscene with a 3D one, which they've shown that they're capable of doing quite well. There are 3 total 3D cutscenes, and while I'm happy to have any at all, I do also think that having more would have been very beneficial. To conclude, Star Varnir is a wonderful addition to Compile Heart's growing library of games, and is the first from this developer that manages to tie together story and gameplay quite well, something that you see far less often than one would expect from the video game industry. Compile Heart's last entry in the Galapagos RPG project, Death End Request, felt at times like it was being dark simply for the sake of trying to create a dark story. However, Dragonstar takes on this very natural feeling melancholy mood with gentle rises and dips. It plays extremely well to its own themes and utilizes them to really pull the player into its world. Star Varnir is without a doubt worth playing, and I'd recommend it to anyone that enjoys JRPGs, story-rich games, and/or turn-based combat. Some people are probably gonna think I'm really cringy for saying this, but especially now in the middle of a pandemic, I think it's important to remind your family just what you think of them. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.